brief discussion of Object ID based on basically Pete's work over the last couple of days. Thanks, Pete, that I've thrown into the existing documents section. We do have a fair bit to get through, but if there's anything else, let me know now, or we can add it to the other business at the end. Nobody's jumping up to say, yes, there's something else. Great. Here is the note well. We've seen it very many times. We have, thank you, Pete. Pete is scribing the jabber. I will take down notes if I need to on anything. I think they've given me a pen so I can scribble them and I'll write up minutes at the end. You've had plenty of time to read the note well. Note it well. Agenda again. Oh, my new slides haven't uploaded. That's okay. So, starting with the existing documents and starting with Civ FCC. Ken, do you have anything you wanted to say on that?
Yeah. So Civ FCC, I believe it's fairly close to being done. There's 2 implementations that I'm aware of. One's in Cyrus, one's in Oracle. Ned had a couple of nits on the email list. He just responded within the last 10 or 15 minutes. He agrees that most of the existing text is okay. He has a new idea that we add a FCC argument to the test notify test and possibly the notify test capability. There's two various tests in the notify extension that we could use to determine whether or not the implementation supports FCC on a particular notification method, which would allow an implementation to only implement it for mail tos as opposed to tells and XMPP and that kind of thing. And the client could determine if that's possible or not. So I think that's a good idea unless there's any objections. If that's the case, I'll write that up and submit another draft.
Fantastic. And the plan is to go to work group last call once we get that draft. I don't even say nodding, I say disengagement. That's good enough. That was some nodding. Yes. All right. Civ special use.
Actually, Ron, minor process. Per a comment last night, if the document does not mention the existing implementations, it might be nice if it did.
Okay. Just as a general point, is that something that stays in the drafts and gets removed from the final document?
It normally does. You can always ask for it otherwise. But the standard text that the RFC that defines the implementation guidance or implementation section has a boilerplate that says this will be removed when the RFC is published.
Perfect. Thank you.
Ken Richardson, so if I could, either Ned or Chris, if you could send me a blurb of text that I could put in the implementations section.
Just go to search the RFC, go to rfceditor.org and search for implementation.
Yeah, I'm aware of the format. I'm just, whatever Oracle would like to have in there.
That document has text that you can copy.
No.
Oh, sorry.
All right. Sorry, we had Civ special use up. Stefan is not on the call, but has been active on the mailing list about this. I assume isn't on Jabber either. Cool. As far as I'm aware, this is basically finished modular, a few nits on the examples of how it would be implemented via IMAP. So I expect this will also go to working group last call once the next round of edits come through. All right. Save date. Save date is basically ready to go to working group last call right now. It was 2 months ago and I completely missed that it had been updated. So I'm just going to make the call on that. Sorry, just before we get to there, I did some new slides a few minutes ago, but they haven't made it through in Data Tracker, so I haven't loaded up that version of it. Basically, the issue with Object ID is that I wrote a lot of things that said should rather than must, because a server might only be able to implement part of it. It adds a requirement to store additional data and some atomicity requirements. And so I pushed a spec that from a client side was you couldn't necessarily trust that things would stay exactly the same. Pete said, that's a bad idea. Why don't you just make it musts everywhere? I'm quite happy to do that as a spec. Certainly my implementation does that. But I could imagine implementations that would have difficulty storing that data. So, Alexi, what's the right path?
Alexi, yeah, we had a chat with Pete about it, and we don't write should if to cope with nuclear war and disks burning in data center type things.
So that one should definitely be a must. It's more if mailbox ID is not something that can be stored.
If you cannot persist it, why would you
return
implement the extension?
Yeah. All right. Then I will change it all to must, and everyone will be happy.
Yeah.
You might as well stay up there because you're on the next slide.
Okay.
Did we discuss the last one?
Yeah, that last must. I will make that a must as well.
Well, so
understand that one of the issue that he replied to was, what if you can't do mailbox ID, but you can do
Per email ID.
per email ID, and then you have no way to, you can't do one without the other unless you split the capability.
I would prefer to split the capability.
I think I'm okay personally with splitting capability if you can really think of cases when people can do one and not the other.
Okay.
And
so,
I assume threading will go with the message ID one, but still can be sort of optional.
well, yeah, we could say object ID equals message ID and object ID equals email ID and object ID equals mailbox ID.
Yeah, we sort of try to do this. Yeah.
Or hyphen. I mean,
There is no ideal solution. It's either,
No.
3 strings and few bytes everywhere, or, yeah.
This is Barry. Are there actually implementations that have this difficulty, or are we just speculating?
I think we're probably mostly just speculating. I can see servers that would have difficulty implementing one and not the other from my knowledge of existing server implementations that are not my one.
I just kind of, and they might not want to do either.
Yeah.
So, I mean, lacking people explicitly saying, I would have trouble implementing this unless we split it, I would rather not split it.
I don't feel strongly either way. I can agree with that.
Strongly.
Yeah.
All right.
So
I'm going to take an executive decision as the author that I won't split it. It'll be all or nothing, and someone can come along with an object ID light specification that adds additional capabilities if they want to later. If
you want, you can make a specific last call on the mailing list asking for objections.
Yep. That seems reasonable.
And just to relay Jeff Snippet from the mic, he says, why not use something like the UID validity equals 0 hack? In other words, if it's a special value, the client can't rely on it. That way an implementation can have per mail ID, but not persistent per mailbox ID. And my reaction is, yeah, you could do that, but then what you're basically saying is you can't trust the capability to tell you that mailbox ID is or is not valid. So, yeah, I mean, the best plan is announce what you intend to do, and if what you intend to do is both of them, then the object ID is sufficient. If we really think there are going to be implementations that can't, then talk about splitting the capability.
Yep. Cool. All right. Let's move on to IMAP 4 Rev 2.
Yes, most of my editing was happening around flying on airplanes. So, it's like, oh, I have half an hour here, so I'll tick off a few things. So next slide. So there is actually 01 now, so this is like out of date. We don't need to talk about history. I think everybody knows about it. Next slide. Yes, the goals. I just left this in case people come later on so that they know what we sort of the fine balance we're trying to achieve. Keep going. Right, so there was 0 posted as a working group draft. Now there is 01 with a small change. The major things I added MD sent and forwarded keywords. They should support. I'm sort of thinking maybe we should upgrade them to must, but if people say this is really going to be problematic, then, should is okay. Then we had a discussion related to status equals size, about 64-bit values for cumulative mailbox sizes. For this, we just, per Chris's suggestion, we updated target X simple ABNF to allow for non-parenthesized number 64 value. So that was done. I did some tidying on registering IMAP and IMAP passport because they are in IN registry. They were never properly registered in any of our documents. And there is a set. Yes, but IMAP isn't. And then, I think that was always implied. It just was never done properly. So minding tidy up. And then status size will be added. It was added in 01. So, keep next. This is just to reiterate. The document has actually an appendix, I think, with what I think should be done and where I keep track of things. These are the major pending. Pending things, I think the next one is going to be literal minus, as discussed. It seems to be popular with people. Body structure might take a bit more effort just because it's well understood problematic area of IMAP, so we probably need more examples. And my experience implementing nested messages and how they represent in body structure, I almost always get it wrong, so I have to test again existing server before writing the code.
Timo's IMAP test is very good for that.
So definitely giving more examples showing, how it is represented and what the pitfalls are would be good. And then next slide talks about some things to take out. I think somewhat related, related to the first one is Chris proposed that we add support for EAI. This affects several locations. It supports UTF-8 and quoted strings. It's UTF-8 mailbox names, and it's full support of UTF-8 in messages themselves. So I took Chris's offer to produce a version of the document that will get this in, and then we can have a look. I think it's that is a rat hole. Okay, so I think short answer, probably login is more of an obsolete command, and probably some implementation will allow UTF-8 there anyway, especially if they're quoted strings. So it's sort of de facto. Authenticate always allowed UTF-8, so it's done. It works there.
This is Barry. I would like to, I haven't checked this in detail, so you may have already done some of this, but I would like to eliminate non-extended list and non-extended search.
Yes.
And have only extended list and eSearch.
Right. So,
And of course, no LSUB.
Yes,
LSUB's already out, right?
no, LSUB is listed on the list, but it's an obvious one. And then, yes, I would like to that all the search responses are always extended.
Yes.
But
And the search command, similar to eSearch being the only search command that's.
it's the same search command. It's just
Yeah.
it just has extra parameters, so it's just getting rid of search response.
And so I'll volunteer. One of the things we're doing, starting with 02, is I'm added to the author list, and I'll take that as an action item to do the list and search ones.
Yeah, Chris Newman, I'm asking if I asked on the list if people have had experience with implementing various aspects of the UTF-8 support in IMAP. It would be really good to get that experience fed into the list sooner rather than later. So just wanted to encourage people to think about it. The reason I think it's important to deal with EAI in IMAP 4 Rev 2 is I think there's a good, if it hits critical mass, I think we're going to have UTF-8 headers leaking all over the place. And when that happens, I think if we do the work now to make it so that clients won't be surprised unpleasantly, I think that'll be better for the clients and the infrastructure.
All right. I guess for that one, it's probably worth asking if, as Barry says, anyone wants to die on the hill of saying we don't want to do this. Is everyone happy with pushing AI as part of Rev 2?
Yeah, that's Barry. I'll just say by way of support for that, in general, this is where we want to go forward from. For a while, anyone who implements this is going to also support standard IMAP and, in a transition period, but I'm hoping that eventually we'll be able to get rid of the standard IMAP and move toward this, and this needs to be future-proof as much as we can.
Yeah, personally, I'm in support of this, but I think it probably was to do the usual stuff and try to reach out to people not particularly active on the mailing list to see if it's going to cause any problems for them, and then they can come here and explain.
Yes, with the disclaimer that ICANN is currently paying me to flog EAI. I've talked to some vendors like Courier. I dared Mr. Courier to add IMAP, and he just went back and said, "Well, here's the first draft." So I think it ain't that hard when you do it. So I think it's actually doable.
Cool. One other thing I wanted to add to that earlier discussion of stuff I'd like to see in Rev 2, vanished response rather than the removal of
Right.
expunged, one expunged.
Right. That was one thing that Bron and I talked about earlier. We should also remove the expunged response and only use vanished.
Yeah. Then the question is, do you want to pull in the rest of conditional quick resync stuff in? And
Maybe not.
I'm okay with that. Well, the problem is it does change the logic in your client significantly. I just had bugs. I had to rewrite it third time. I got it right third time, but I know it changes logic in your client.
Sure, but just the vanished response is, I also know a lot of people who had trouble correctly implementing the handling of expunged responses in clients because of how quirky that is. So the vanished response is just so much easier to deal with on both sides. And I believe the vanished response is independent of the rest of the quick resync stuff. So
I would also add one more thing to that, which is that the unsolicited response when flags change should include the UID, which currently you can't for really old clients. But
right, it's actually it's one of the things on to-do list as a question mark. So please emphasize this. Are we taking notes of this?
Yes, I'm taking notes.
Right. So adding vanish and UID responses on unsolicited responses is a good idea. Yeah. Okay.
And I'm figuring the general statement of that is that we are just using UIDs whenever we can in this new version and trying to minimize the use or the requirement to use message numbers.
Yes.
This is Ken. Barry had mentioned going with list extended predominantly. In a previous slide, you had talked about combining list and status. Are we talking about some of the extended list extensions as well? Hopefully.
So extended list is already in the document. The base extended list, minus the multiple list pattern that nobody likes, even me. But there is only one extension at the moment implicitly is list. Actually, so
List my rights
status
is on
in
the way-
list
on its way.
is something which is again on the suggested list. If people think it's a good idea now, let's do it.
I think it's a good idea.
I'd probably advocate for list my rights as well.
The only reason for not to maybe do that is that it could be expensive.
Well, okay, so there are people who like. Okay. There are people who like SIMAP ACL RFC and the people who don't. And for people who don't, this is going to be annoying. So it's not as nice and clear cut as it could have been, or, you know. So, yeah, I sort of not against my rights, but I think it falls into the category of I'm not entirely sure. We also discussed, have a section about recommended other extensions that it would be nice to implement, even though they're not part of the base spec. So maybe
That's one.
maybe it's one of them.
Yeah, and I'll take back my, it could be expensive, because if the client asks for it, the client wants it, and you need to do it. But so, yeah, I'll go with put it in as not a requirement, but a recommended extension.
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
My rights is recommended. Good.
All right. Add binary was the, so I have to skip forward to the next slide. We're nearly at the end of the time we allocated for this. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I have implemented binary both client and server side. I find it useful. Would like to hear what other people have to say.
I have not implemented binary append because it's hard on the server.
Yes. Okay, how about we'll discuss this on the mailing list and we'll see what, you know. Again, I'm not even sure whether it qualifies for recommended others who want to do, but I want to see more discussion of where people think it is. It makes client implementations easier. But, you know, so, you're right. Some component needs to downgrade it. You know, in this case, it will have to be IMAP server that has to downgrade it to, you know, from binary to something else.
Yes, we have implemented binary fetch, and I'd have no objection to including binary fetch, but binary append is a different matter.
Interesting. That might actually be a potential happy halfway point. So yeah, let's discuss on the mailing list. Done.
All right. And then we had the slide on past changes. It's all good. All good. All right. Thanks, Alexi. I should have kept this open in a separate file. No, next time. All right, proposed new documents. The first one was IMAP replace. Stuart can't make it to this, he said. I don't think he's appeared there, no. But he said, as far as he's concerned, it's pretty much ready to go. And the discussion on the mailing list seemed fairly complete.
I don't remember whether we had resolved the question of, that I think, Pete, were you the one who brought it up? Somebody brought up replace versus...
An addition to the append command.
Yes. We had resolved that. We're going with the separate replace command.
Yes, that was resolved.
Okay.
So I expect to do a call for adoption right here in the room. Do we believe that this is work that we expect, followed by taking that to the mailing list?
Area director red flag, you know, you cannot say that. You can poll the room whether people here think it's a good idea, but you still need to verify on the mailing list.
You should just ask on the mailing list if there are any objections to adopt.
Yeah.
Yep. Cool. All right. And then I expect it will go to working group last call fairly quickly if adopted. Cool. Next up is the Fetch Snippet. There's a whole separate set of slides for this. I don't know if someone is going to be speaking to them or not, though. Aha, that'll be a yes.
Yeah.
All right, I'll bring up your slides and let's go. Full screen, I know. Hi, Michael.
Oh, we see his little box in the corner.
We can't hear you. No, is the answer to that. He just asked on Jabber. I have pushed his button.
We could go through the slides and pretend he's talking.
We can. I mean, they're very pretty slides. So
Go through the slides and have to read what if you want to add anything to Jabber.
all right, Meet Echo says can't see here, Michael. Let's do that.
Yeah.
Oh, bouncing.
Take him out of the queue and
I've hit the button.
Yes, for people new, we have a new remote access thing, which comes with a big red button. You push it once to add people to the queue. You push it once to eject them. So it's,
All right. Do you want to try and enter again, Michael? Have people in the room read through the slides already? No? All right, well,
no, but we might have enough opinion. Maybe. If it's informed opinion, I don't know. Would you like to how many slides are there?
8, I think.
So just flip slowly through them.
All right.
Oh,
Let's try. Here we go. Has joined the queue again. And
How about now?
hello.
Yeah. Let's turn off the video. You don't need to see me.
okay. Wait for 15 seconds and then start speaking. That used to help previously.
How about now?
That's
Better.
good.
All right. Apologies, everyone. Try long-time lurker. And it's nice to be able to actually talk and see some of the faces of people I've chatted with on the mailing list. Real quickly, I don't know how deeply I need to get into the snippet details. I think everybody in this room probably.
Yeah, I think you can
understands.
start on slide 3, the issues,
Yeah.
because we all know the goals.
Yeah. From both a server and client side, this is an expensive operation to generate these snippets. I have object storage vendors that worry about clients that do this kind of activity without any sort of snippet availability. And so that was one of the
Yeah. Pete's already commented. Anyway. So this is it's expensive to calculate the little bit that displays on the screen is the basic summary of the problem statement. And the solution is to have the server generate something. Dovecot has an implementation already, and it extends the IMAP fetch command with a snippet, which can be, there's one algorithm which is fuzzy, and there's a modifier lazy, which says only return it if it's easy and cheap, aka you already have a cache one.
We have implemented fuzzy. I strongly support advancing this and adopting this.
Cyrus IMAP also has an implementation that drives our JMAP preview. And there's a beautiful example.
Yeah, my recollection of the mailing list discussion that people were generally supportive. So, again, okay.
So I'm going to spend my entire 5 minutes with technical difficulties.
I've talked through a couple of your slides and everyone said, yes, this sounds great so far.
Yeah, I think the issues that have come up so far have really been more minor. Brian, it's mostly been you saying some of the mapping between the snippet, some of the boundaries that we have put into the initial draft and what you're doing and say like JMap are a little bit off, but I think that's something that we can resolve going forward. But other than that, we try to keep this as simple as possible and somewhat extensible. I mean, the idea being there is a possible use case for us using IMAP as a voicemail system. There would be a separate snippet extension for transcriptions, for example. So that would be the way that we could retrieve a transcription for a particular voicemail message instead of trying to do some sort of metadata thing. So that's why it was made fairly extensible. I don't know the thoughts of the people in the room, whether that's a good idea or it makes sense to kind of make this a little more extensible rather than just making it a single snippet.
This is Barry. I think that's kind of a cool one. Okay. Being unsure, I'd have to go back and read it, but the way I would like to see lazy work is that you don't necessarily get the untagged response with the lazy snippet immediately. You might get it 10 minutes later or something. Is that interesting to anyone? That it sort of says, when you get around to computing a lazy snippet, send it to me whenever that may be. Does that sound interesting to anyone?
I think
code complexity alert, basically. On the client side, not on the server side.
I understand, but the point on the client side is that clients in general should be able to accept untagged responses from the server at any time. So it ought to work.
Chris Newman, responding to your question, Barry, my problem with that proposal is I don't believe the server has enough context to know which of the responses to prioritize to return. I don't believe that sort of delayed response would be useful until we start doing something about doing it, unless we first do a client state on the server extension so that the server actually knows what the client's interested in.
Is that a queue? It's kind of a jumble of standing people.
Okay, this is John Levine, and feel free to tell me that I am nuts, but particularly from commercial mailers, I get a lot of mail where kind of the Chrome in the picture is more important than the text. And I'm wondering if there's any thought about how you could send a snippet that might be something other than text.
Michael.
Or how the server would even know which is the important bit.
Well, presumably, if this is popular enough, you could, commercial mailers will do whatever you tell them to do to make their stuff show up. So if you can say, put this snippet thing in to give us a hint, they will implement it in milliseconds.
This is Ken. Kind of an open question regarding the transcoding of voicemails. Are we overloading snippet at that point? There is an existing convert extension for transcoding. I wonder if that wouldn't be better placed there.
All right. Just as a time issue, we probably shouldn't spend too long back shedding this. We can do this after adopting.
The right answer is to ask on the mailing list if there are objections to adopting this, and then we can hash this stuff out.
Yeah, I expect this one will take a little longer to get to a final
state.
I
just want to second this. I think there is enough interest to work on this, but it might not look quite like snippet at the moment at the end. So we'll not trying to prejudge it, but let's discuss on the mailing list.
Cool. All right. Michael, anything else? He's gone. All right. Thank you, Michael. And next, we're going to jump straight to client ID because that's the next thing on my slides. You can use the microphone up the front if you want as well. That's the presenter microphone. You get your slides.
Well, thank you, everybody. And oops. Because of the time constraints and the scheduling and everything else, we do have asked that everybody read through the slides ahead of time, and hopefully everybody has done it. Just to get you an idea, we've spent an awful lot of time, as I said, we produced a product called Magic Mill. We've spent the last 2 years working on solving some industry solutions, and this has resulted in the request that this become set as a standard. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to provide a mechanism. In the real world right now, we have a lot of problems with email compromises, databases being compromised, brute force attacks, where the legacy, the idea of having the username and password, where traditionally it would represent that only you are the person who would have those authentication credentials. In the real world today, there is no assertion that you are the one that is actually presenting those authentication credentials. And while the holy grail that we all would love to have is that, we could uniquely determine that it is actually you using your authentication credentials, we're not at that stage. Two-factor authentication has been attempted in many different ways. A lot of times it's very difficult for adoption. There's concerns with some of the proposals using third-party authentication factors that has really resulted in a situation where we have an industry that really hasn't been able to move towards any type of a solution to correct this. And, since we work with so many ISPs and telcos that are using your product, we see a lot of real world examples. And after 2 years of looking at this problem, we're considering the fact that we need a new method that is easily adoptable by the industry. And so what we've determined is that what we'd like to do is we'd like to make sure that IMAP supports the concept of being able to present a client ID as part of the transaction. And that way that the IMAP protocol itself can use that to help be used for deterministic definitions of whether somebody should be able to present the authentication credentials at all. Now, if you've read all the slides, a whole bunch of background arguments, but since we only have 15 minutes, I'm going to cut it real short and ask, does anybody have any questions straight out about the concept and the reasoning behind why we think the ability to lock your mailbox so that only your devices or class of devices can even present authentication credentials?
This is Barry. I personally would hate that because I never know when I might need to use some other client to log in. So I do not want to lock it to a client.
Well, there's always going to be, as when we're talking about adoption, the whole point of this is right now ISPs are afraid to do anything universal. They wouldn't want to lock everybody's mailboxes to predefined boxes because, of course, that would be difficult. But we already have solutions for that in the sense if you forgot your password, or you want to add a new device, or you want to change what, you buy a new iPad or buy a new iPhone. Mechanisms are really be able to be provided that you can easily either unlock your account or use a mechanism to do this. But we're not saying that it has to be done by everybody, but by presenting this, we allow that we can now, instead of having to sit there and say that this is a server-wide policy, we can define it so that the people who do want to log in only from their 4 devices and never, only change it once a year, have the capability to do so.
It is generally not the user's choice. It's generally inflicted on the user, and I detest it.
Of course, but we're saying that, that is a vendor, that would be a vendor responsibility. But right there are things that you have to understand. The ISPs and telcos don't inflict anything. That's why they still allow things like plain text passwords, over non-encrypted connections, when we all as an industry would say that, yes, probably one of the best things we could do is inflict, say, TLS for all customers.
It's a different version of inflict. I would prefer that we spend our efforts on better authentication mechanisms that don't involve sending passwords over the wire and not put our efforts into this kind of locking, whatever. But can we get to the meat of it rather than the background of it?
Yeah.
Do you have slides explaining what exactly you want to?
Well, the actual draft is online. Have you had a chance to review the draft?
I have not yet. That's why I'm looking for more of an explanation.
Brian, I'm just going to interject with one thing here to answer your point there a bit, Barry, that a lot of, certainly in the web space, a lot of systems store a cookie on the machine to be able to detect that it's the same machine. And this is, my reading of it shows this is something fairly similar. It's often, for example, Google will detect that you're logging in from somewhere unexpected and put an additional password request or a second factor
That's
check.
the sort of stuff that I object to. It's partly because I just don't like the interface, partly because I think it, by keeping a record of the client and what the client has done, I think we have privacy leak potential in that sort of thing. So I suspect the security area will have questions about this as we proceed.
Right, should we get to the, is this the right slide for description of how it works, or should?
Sorry, most of the slides were based on providing background to understand how the industry is going to use it, and which is why, because of the shortened time constraint, we'd ask that everybody please review it so we're prepared to actually discuss the implementation and sit-in purposes. I'm afraid if we need to sit there and spend more time on it, I can actually will be glad to sit there and talk more in a, if we had given more a space to do it. But I want to understand that what I'm looking for is that the group actually consider this for discussion.
Sean Leonard. So I just want to clarify, when the CID doesn't match because the user's on a different device or different environment, what exactly is the fallback mechanism you're proposing? Because you alluded to the industry has ways of dealing with that, and the most common way is you get a password reset request by email, but we're talking about accessing your email inbox, so that doesn't make any sense.
No, actually, as you know, the same thing would happen as a forgot password. There is whatever mechanisms that are generally, conceived of for places that are using forgot passwords. There are mechanisms to deal with this, but what the important aspect is that the SID, as we said, is not an authentication. This is an access control layer, and what we're trying to do is provide that IMAP actually has the ability, whether it's by a server base or a domain base or even by a user base, to be able to start implementing access control levels. We already do it by IP, by country, by ACLs. What we're wanting to do it is we want to be able to provide a device such that, of course, an implementer can design it such that if an unrecognized device were to attempt to access your mail account, you at least now can have alert. We're not all Googles and we're not all Apples and Microsofts. What we need is something that is ubiquitous throughout the IMAP server world so that everybody would have this capability if they choose to leverage it.
So I guess I just echo Barry's concerns that this may make IMAP and the protocol is just less useful and less user friendly. I would say if we want to do that, we could just use OAuth in IMAP. So I'll leave it at that.
And just to follow up one more time, this is, again, not an absolute that it's going to be an on-off switch, and that should be very clear.
Okay, so I have read, Chris Newman, I have read the proposal. I think there is actually a problem here that we could, that could use attention. I don't think the authentication and authorization mechanisms the IETF has produced are serving the industry needs. We are getting to the point where a number of providers, Google included, if you implement a standards compliant client, it cannot authenticate or interoperate with Gmail. It cannot. You have to write a custom authentication mechanism to talk to them. So that would enable an option now. Or you generate a client-specific password using a mechanism. Gmail
which is just
offers.
another way of correlating individual clients.
Which, yeah, you're right. Yep. So I think there is a problem that needs attention. I'm not particularly fond of this particular proposal. I mean, my first question is why make syntax changes to 3 to 5 different protocols? In my case, it's SMTP, POP, IMAP, Managed Civ, and MTQP. We all implement when you can make one syntax change to one protocol and solve the problem. and that would be SASL. So to me, this model is change set hostile to products that implement more than one protocol, which is actually most mail clients and servers implement more than one protocol. Why is it a separate command rather when it can be part of the authentication command? It adds round trip to all clients that don't pipeline. I think people are concerned about round trips. So that's a problem I have with this. SASL is less prone to data leakage than general protocol commands since it's already authorization authentication related. It gets auditing priority for data leakage and privacy issues. Best to keep this data together in the part of the protocol designed to contain this information. And then the other question I have is how does this promote interoperability? If I'm pulling a client from one vendor and a server from another vendor, they'll only interoperate if the semantics of a given client ID attribute are provided and the set of mandatory to implement attributes are consistent between the two implementations. So where's the technical information to get that interoperability? My counter proposal would be define a family of client ID SASL mechanisms that have a uniform syntax and share an attribute name registry. And then the name of the mechanism determines the mandatory set of attributes. So that allows you to interoperate.
Thank you very much. That's really good arguments, and it's something we've also looked at very deeply. As I mentioned, we've spent 2 years looking at various implementations at it, and it really quickly came to us that when we look at SID, it is not part of an authentication mechanism. It's independent. It's an access control layer, and the SMTP protocols themselves are the ones that are usually responsible for access control. This is saying whether or this is giving an access control layer which enables by any rule set that the vendor would decide to implement whether authentication is accessible. Right, and it was not actually an authentication mechanism. Having said that, there are some very good points that you have addressed that should be actually discussed as part, and it's another reason why I'd like to bring it into the argument. There are some areas there that you did discuss as far as SID and SID type, and we've intentionally led those slightly vague and already have had some great suggestions on some extra language that if this was adopted, we could include in this draft.
Relaying from the Jabber room for Ned Freed, Ned says, there's a big difference between asking for additional verification when switching clients and restricting users to a subset of clients. The first I can live with, the second not so much. And I think we've heard similar in the room.
And actually, that's why we call it, like, jokingly, 2.5 factor. The SID, presenting a device ID or a device type, it has a lot farther reaching aspects when we talk about being able to provide for an ACL. There is no mechanism at this point to provide that a device or a class of devices are able to connect. For instance, theoretical implementation, an Apple server could say, hey, only Apple clients can connect. And if you don't present a SID type of an Apple license ID, for instance, we don't want to allow you. So the SID is a part of an ACL mechanism that can be leveraged by many different methods, including SASLs, other ACLs, and the ability to allow what we really want to do is to allow vendors to be able to pass in a user's choice right to the protocol, the ACLs in the protocol, the access control layers.
So sitting from the chair, I'm going to say to the whole room one of the things that I said to you yesterday was that I suggested that this client ID is a client-side cookie. It's worth looking at how U2F has handled different host names getting different cookies so that they can't correlate the same client between each other. And that's another area to look at in here.
And that's a very good question. And maybe at some future time, somebody would consider that, the whole concept of SID and SID types might be actually fleshed out where better definitions of the use of a specific SID type or recommendations to people who may be implementing it on client side. When you ask them to determine their own client type and own client IDs, that they take extra considerations. And it should be noted, of course, that, as far as we're concerned, that the SID information should only be presented across secure layers. Okay.
Alexi, I guess this is where I bring the question to you. Do you believe that this is within scope for this group as our area director, this work?
I think the answer is it depends. If it's a purely IMAP extension and people want to work on this, then it will be in scope, right? Because the chart is very open-ended. If people prefer Chris's variant of doing it through SASL framework, then I need to talk to other area directors, because there is a standing working group for SASL work, which is Kitten.
And again, I'd like to argue that that our proposal is specifically not to make this a SASL issue, that this is a access control layer issue that belongs in the IMAP protocol.
Yeah, I think my feeling of the room is that you need to convince people that's true. I'm not sure everybody buys into this interpretation. I think people agreeing that there is something to possibly work on here, but whether it's part of authentication, authorization, access control, I think that might be more in a gray area. I think we need more discussion of this.
Yeah, this is Barry. I don't buy that it's access control, because we have no precedent for having access control to the authenticate command. It's access control to resources once you're authenticated. You are providing this as access control for me to be able to access the authenticate command. And so I don't buy that.
But as I said, it's extensible beyond that. That's why we said it's 2.5 factor. One of the components is presenting whether it should be allowed to communicate to an access mechanism. There are many legacy mechanisms for auth that simply return a true or false, that have no capabilities to do more than that. This would actually support so that you could use that if you choose, but it can also be used for a lot of other access control layers, i.e., as I just presented, you could restrict access to an IMAP's mechanisms solely by the SID type that was presented, or the device type.
So again, relaying for Ned Freed, he asks, what about submit, for instance, and how does this interact with JMAP? And to clarify, one of his earlier comments was, it's not just for IMAP, it has to at least cover submit.
As a matter of fact, we've already rolled out a draft for submission, and you can also see a reference to this. SMTP submission is one of the, of course, greatest uses of bots, tags, dictionary tags, reused passwords, brute force, and dictionary. And SID immediately gives us a lot of value in that area, which is why we spent 2 years investing in.
So just to understand your answer, so you're saying this is not IMAP specific. It also can apply to other protocols like SMTP submit.
I would phrase that the use of a client identifier could be used in theory for any type of access, but it is not specific to an authentication.
Okay. And just to add one little thing, this is Pete speaking, not Ned anymore. I noticed that you've adopted this use of SID, which I just want to dissuade you from using long term, because of course, for a lot of IMAP people and SMTP people, CID is content ID, which gets used in URIs and all sorts of other places, and you're going to end up with some confusion. But just to throw acronym overload but that's a very minor issue.
Yeah, and we accept that if we get adopted by the working group, conversations like that about what the best name and title. I mean, even in our implementation, we could quickly, change the advertised value.
Yeah, this is John Levine. I mean, I agree with Ned that if it's worth doing at all, we got to do it across POP, IMAP, and submit. And if we're going to do it in all three of them, the way the IETF works really has to go into SASL, because that is where they share authentication schemes. Doing it through SASL is not a death sentence. I mean, new SASL methods do occasionally appear.
Right, but again, I have to talk about the industry and about the ISP adoption and everything else. We can implement new SASLs, etc. But introducing these things as from the ISP level, as I said, we have a real problem in the industry of adopting these new, better technologies, adopting better authentication, right? And then, we talk about, the difficulty of engineers in the environment to actually, implement these things and restrict it globally. What we're looking for is an avenue that would be conducive to being able to offer individuals that stronger ability to make sure that the only person who can use their authentication credentials of any type, of any model, right, can be limited to the devices that they own.
And this is Barry. I'll repeat that that's marketing. That's not the way it's going to work if this is rolled out, and that's what bothers me. So I agree with John that if it's done, it should be done through SASL. And I'll repeat what I said before, that I would much rather see us spend our effort on better authentication mechanisms and not putting the client identification into the authentication process. I think that's wrong.
And I have no argument that maybe both of these endeavors should be done separately, but we have a way to sit there and immediately solve industry pain points that are easily adoptable. And I'd like to sit there and ask everybody to have an open mind that maybe both methods should be considered, because I'd be a strong supporter of any type of improved authentication mechanisms. However, this is not strictly authentication, and I want to make sure that that's clear. There's a lot of other purposes that this is meant to solve.
Chris Newman, just as a data point on the deployability question, if a customer came to me and said, I want to add a command to 5 of your, to 2 to 5 of your protocols, I would, the answer would be no. If they said, I want to plug in a different SASL mechanism that does what I need, the answer is, here's the SDK, have at it. So in terms of deployability, SASL mechanism, from my perspective, way, way more deployable. Plus, I have a shared library, so I appreciate that. If I wanted it, I'd implement it in the library, and all of my customers would have it like that.
From an engineering perspective, you have an absolutely excellent argument. But as I said, we're still in a world where, even though we have much better authentications, there's still a lot of ISPs that are still allowing plain text passwords over non-TLS connections. We're talking about that type of adoptability.
So, sorry about that. This is Pete Resnick. I think you're getting wrapped around a weird axle here. The use of SASL is a syntactic choice, right? That it is called SASL, that it has the word authentication in it, is absolutely irrelevant. What's being claimed here, I think, by folks in the room is, if you want to do client ID as some sort of other kind of authentication, be it passwords, be it whatever it is, if you want to do client ID as something that you do to first talk to the server, it can be done syntactically using the SASL mechanisms. And then if you want to go on to use plain text passwords, or you want to use TLS protected, or you want to use whatever you want to use, that what you want to do is move this out of the IMAP discussion and make it a separate piece of syntax that can be used across different protocols, whether it's SMTP, whether it's IMAP, whether it's anybody else who uses. And SASL happens to be the one that we can plug into different protocols.
Just as a time check, we have 2 minutes left on our...
I'd like to sit there and propose that we actually bring this into the working group so that we can have these kinds of discussions. And actually, what's something very interesting is by bringing this into, as you mentioned, bringing this in as in the IMAP, what it could do is it could preface that if this was now made available, say, for instance, a SASL mechanism may be able to prove out the definition so that it could be used and deployed much more easily amongst all protocols. But as I said.
Well, and the only caveat there is, now if this becomes something that the IETF feels like is going to go eventually across protocols, you're going to have the IASG, I think, and Alexi can speak to it specifically, say, wait a minute, we don't want just the IMAP folks to work on this. Maybe it's going to be that set of folks who do the proof of concept, but we don't want we would want a rechartering to indicate that you're specifically working on this so that everybody knows and other security folks can come in and comment on it.
And one last thing, because we're running out of
Before you
time.
continue, I'd like, just adding to that, I have no objection to having the working group continue to discuss this on the mailing list. I object to having us make this document a working group product at this stage. But that doesn't mean we can't continue discussing it on the mailing list, and I'm happy to do that.
And I'd like to sit there and pose, there's also a lot of other vendors that I've been talking about who also recognize that the capabilities about having these type of capabilities in the protocol themselves, independent of, any type or any form of SASL that might be used, or any other authentication, because there are a lot of other authentications that are out in the wild that are not SASL, that I would like to sit there and bring it open to the group so that we can maybe bring other arguments about why this should be IMAP specific. And we could also talk about SASL should also examine a parallel similar type of method. Because I have talked to several other vendors who may not be here in this session that have also expressed interest that they could see the benefits of this type of thing being available in IMAP clients. Thank you.
All right, we'll leave this for now. We're basically at the end of our time. The last thing we had here was other business. I put two potential things to talk about there, whether the junk, not junk, dollar phishing keywords are sufficient for reporting spam via IMAP, or whether we want to start any work on a better way of clients informing servers and servers informing clients of mail that is not good.
This is Barry. Has anyone proposed such a thing?
No, not yet. No, good. And I.
That is actually something that I'd like to see more discussion about. If I can sit there and ask that somehow that I want to explore more of that on the mailing list.
All right, and we can discuss anything on the mailing list.
And please just come to the microphone and say that so that the people remote can hear. Thanks.
Sorry, it's just something that, we've talked amongst a lot of our vendors and one thing is that we do not have the ability for clients universally to have a method of that is supported by all clients, or a concept that says allow sender, block sender in a webmail. I would really like to be able to, enhance this conversation so that maybe it could be a universal method that everybody could support. So this is a great opener for that conversation.
All right, we'll definitely take that to the mailing list. The final item here was the created modseek stuff that I proposed an initial draft for this, but we soon realized that you had to have a concept of a global modseek across an entire account, so a single counter across all folders. Is this something anyone else is interested in, or should I just leave this as a Cyrus internal? Not seeing Alexi.
Speaking as an individual, I think we probably should continue discussing this. There might not everybody implementing modseek would want to implement this, but there might be enough interest to,
Chris Newman, I'll second that because my immediate response to your question was I want to think about this some more.
All right. Thanks, everybody. That is our time. Is there anything else anyone wants to talk about right now? Very, very quickly. All right. Thanks.
Yeah.
No, still on. Microphone's on. No. All right. Blue sheets are floating around. Yeah.